So with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about our pit date. It's going to be January 26th, 2023, and that is a Thursday. All right, so our agenda for today, we're going to talk about some pit basics. We're going to go into a little bit about methodology. We're going to talk about unsheltered planning and sheltered planning. We talked a bit about best practices for volunteer coordination, and then collaboration, and then the next steps to take after this training. And if y'all have any questions at any time, I'm going to be stopping intermittently between slides just to check in, and you can drop any questions in the chat and I will address them. All righty, with that out of the way, let's just go ahead and dive right in. So we have to, unfortunately, talk just a little bit about COVID. So at this time, we haven't received word from HUD regarding COVID-19 and the upcoming pit count. So for those of you who didn't know, we were able to do a full pit count last year. And we plan on doing that again in 2023, as long as it's safe to do so. We would still say that the COVID situation is very fluid and we can't predict if there's going to be like another spike in cases or a new variant. So as we approach the count, of course, we'll have a better idea of what that is looking like, and we'll keep y'all posted on anything that we foresee being a safety issue. All right, so in the meantime, we want to make sure that each community can have access to PPE, such as masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer. And if you have any concerns about accessing PPE, please reach out to me. My contact info will be at the very end of this presentation. All right, so let's go into some pit basics. So here are some of the questions that the pit count aims to answer, as well as a definition of the point in time count. So the point in time count is an unduplicated count on a single night of people in a community experiencing homelessness. So the other way I like to think about it is the point in time count is the minimum number of individuals experiencing homelessness in your community on a single night. So why do we do the pit count in the first place? So there are four main reasons that we conduct the point in time count. So we conduct it for awareness, to advocate to local governments and raise community awareness, to understand the extent of homelessness by identifying trends and the characteristics of those who experience it, to secure funding, as the pit count can be used for eligibility for COC and ESG federal funding, as well as to advocate for local or private funds, and for engagement, as the pit count allows us to develop personal relationships with those experiencing homelessness and create a sense of responsibility with various stakeholders. Sorry, that's my dog back there. Okay, so let's go into some quick information about THN itself. I won't go in too much in depth, but I think it's important to talk a little bit about the difference between THN and the Texas BOS. So the Balance of State team focuses on those 215 of Texas's 254 counties, while our statewide initiatives team focuses on efforts across the state and coordinates directly with other COCs. All right, so to help visualize the area that we covered in the last full pit count in 2022 versus our region, here are two maps. So on the right, you can see that we have the Texas Balance of State map with our counties highlighted there in blue. And on the left is our 2022 pit coverage highlighted by those dots on the map. So in 2022, we were able to cover about 74% of our COC's entire population. So about 26% did not have any pit coverage in 2022. All right, so normally I stray away from this discussion about extrapolation, but I feel like it's important for you to know how your data affects our overall numbers that we report to HUD. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development requires us to submit data on the entirety of our geography. And we're not able to cover our full geography, obviously, due to how large it is. So in order to account for the counties within our COC that do not participate and don't have any pit coverage, we use extrapolation to determine the number of unhoused individuals within those non-participating counties. So we use data from participating counties like yours, in order to estimate the number of homeless individuals within non-participating counties. And that's how your data comes into play within this process. So we match up counties based on their population similarities in order to extrapolate the number of people experiencing homelessness within those counties. I'm mentioning this because it's important to note that your data comes into play within this process. It's important to note how your data comes into this process. The data that we collect on the night of the count has a major effect on the results outside of your designated regions. So because of this, we must ensure a high standard of data quality so that the final data submission to HUD is accurate. So this can include making sure that we ask all the questions on the survey, work to reduce duplicates, and expanding our coverage into new areas if we have the capacity to do so. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this contact flow chart. So this flow chart just demonstrates how our roles work together. This is just a simplified chart on how we communicate with each other, depending on the type of information. So just to give a quick overview, for most situations involving logistics, direct your questions to me. Again, my contact information will be at the very end of this presentation. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or concerns as we get deeper into the season, approaching November, December, and January. I'm here to help and support you, of course, and if your volunteers have questions about community information, they should contact you, the pit leads. But if you don't have an answer, you can always forward those questions to me and I'd be happy to help. All right, so this graphic is just a simplified list of the primary tasks required for a successful point in time count. So as you all start planning your training processes, you'll receive more specific and detailed guidance. And I would also like to stress that community engagement should be occurring throughout the entirety of the process. And you will need to decide as a community what structure best suits your needs. Alrighty, so now a quick overview of the count itself. So this slide is just meant to demonstrate the types of individuals that you would survey for the count. So we have the counts broken down into two pieces. We have the unsheltered portion and the sheltered portion. So the unsheltered portion is looking for people and serving individuals who are living on the streets, in outdoor encampments and other places not meant for human habitation. And then we have our sheltered location surveys that are surveying folks that are in emergency shelters, perhaps a domestic violence shelter or transitional housing. And this also includes a hotel or motel paid for by an agency voucher. So again, please remember that the count involves you directly interacting with each person experiencing homelessness and conducting a survey with them. All right, so now that we know who to count, we need to talk a little bit about who we do not count in our pit count. So we don't count individuals residing in permanent housing and temporary living situations. So what do we mean by that? So permanent housing is considered permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing programs, HUD VASH projects and FEMA projects. And temporary living situations are considered, people who are at risk of homelessness, doubled up with family or friends, and maybe in a hotel or motel that is paid for by their own funds, not an agency voucher. And that also includes people in foster care, sober living, or a halfway house, as well as a criminal justice or health facility such as a jail or a hospital. We would not count those individuals. Alrighty, so this is the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act definition of homeless children and youth. So you will notice that on this slide, I have highlighted several phrases in red font. So the parts in red are the aspects of this definition that do not fit into the pit count definition. So those include children and youth who are sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason, are abandoned in hospitals, or are awaiting foster care placement, or have substandard housing. So while these students may count as homeless within their schools, they do not qualify as counting for the point in time count. All righty, y'all. So before we dive into unsheltered planning and sheltered planning, I just want to stop here and see if we have any questions before we go ahead and move on.
Alex, we've seen this one in the past, but what about if it's a very unlivable, like RV type situation? Would that person be counted?
Like living within a like an RV full time?
But say there was like no power, no water, that type situation.
Yeah, we do count individuals residing in vehicles. So yeah, I think under the PIT definition, they should be counted. Is that correct, Kira?
Yeah, so this is I love Craig always throwing the hardest questions at us as though he's not supposed to be on our side. Just kidding. So for the RV, it's kind of one of those situations where we leave it up to the community to kind of make a determination based off of a number of different factors related to habitability. So like if it's an RV that is not in disrepair, it is connected to like water and has the ability to have electricity, that wouldn't count. If it is an RV where they have the capability of connecting to those utilities, but like let's say they don't have the money to pay for it, that is kind of where we fall into this gray area. But then if there's an RV where it is like in disrepair, they're exposed to the elements, it doesn't have the capability of having like water or electricity, that is when they absolutely would count under the PIT definition. So what I would say the best way to kind of approach this, and I'll plop it into the chat, we have a habitability checklist for determining unsheltered locations that we added in last year. So what I'll do is I'll put that into the chat for folks who are trying to make that determination. But when in doubt, feel free to contact Alex and we can kind of talk you through what those different habitability standards are and what the application of that is.
Cool. We have another question from, there we go. From Andy Richardson asking, so when we're training folks, they're basically using CE intake criteria and sharing that information in an easy to understand way for the PIT volunteers. Well, we do have a volunteer training that's going to be coming out around December that will go into a little bit more detail around that. It will be a little bit more easy to understand than this, and we'll talk a little bit more about maybe scripts to use. Kira, do you have anything to add for this question?
I think I'm just a little bit confused on what exactly Andy's asking. So yeah, I'm wondering if maybe you're just kind of wondering the process for training volunteers. And like Alex said, we have like pre-recorded training materials, and then we also give y'all presentation slides that you can use as your basis. So if we're missing the point, like Craig said, if you want to come off mute or add more context into the chat, we can jump in.
Okay, cool. Sweet. Well, I think if anybody doesn't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and continue. All right, so let's talk a bit about unsheltered planning. So the unsheltered PIT, often referred to as the street count, is a count of individuals who are residing in places not meant for human habitation. So this requires identification of persons that are living in places not meant for human habitation on January 26th, that Thursday that we're conducting the point in time count. All right, so the locations that we consider for the unsheltered count include abandoned buildings, buses, or bus stations, train stations, and airports, people living in a park, on the street or a sidewalk, in tents, under bridges, near the overpass, and in vehicles such as a car, a van, an RV, or a truck, or maybe in the woods or an outdoor encampment. So we recommend that pit leads create a map or a list of common areas where people can be found. So this can be used to help inform volunteer routes as they go out to survey people on the night of the point in time count. So prepare for the unsheltered count by creating your map zones. So these are areas that the team of volunteers will cover, and seek input from your pit committee, your community partners, and people with lived experience when mapping your survey locations. You may need to update your maps closer to the date of the count, as the locations frequented by people experiencing homelessness may change due to weather conditions, or we also recommend looking for hotspots about 1 to 2 weeks before the count. So let's talk a little bit more about, Craig mentioned, I've seen some communities partner with their local police departments and outreach teams to help identify locations to survey. Yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit more about engaging law enforcement later on in the presentation. Let's talk a little bit more about creating hotspot maps. So we recommend sorting your maps into priority groups based on the anticipated number of people in each zone. So if you're short of volunteers on the night of the count, prioritize the higher density zones. So to identify known locations, we recommend engaging outreach workers and police, like Craig mentioned, EMS, bylaw and park officers, businesses, and others to help you identify those hotspots on the night of the count. So we also recommend maybe taking a walkabout or a drive-by in advance of the count date to identify and confirm those locations. And again, consult people with lived experience and consult people who are experiencing homelessness to get a sense of where to canvass and how to approach potential interviewees, especially those in outdoor encampments. So note that different populations experiencing homelessness may also stay in different locations. So for example, a youth may gravitate towards a more secluded area, such as a forest, whereas a single adult might be more likely to stay in plain view on the street. So again, consult a range of stakeholders to ensure that your mapping accurately reflects the diversity of experiences among people experiencing homelessness within your community. And please make sure to visit those hotspots regularly in the months leading up to the count, again, as these locations might change. And I also recommend developing some type of collaborative document to track locations and to update each other on any significant changes. So on this slide, I've included a few helpful resources on where you can create a hotspot map, as well as a video tutorial on how to create pins for each location. You don't need exact addresses. Approximate streets should work just fine. This document can help you determine how many volunteers you're going to need in order to cover all those locations that you've identified. This will help volunteers on the day of the count as they head out to conduct surveys. So again, you can download this PowerPoint and access these links. The link is in the chat, and it's also going to be on our website as well. Alrighty, so here's a list of potential community partners you should try to engage in the point in time count. So the ones with asterisks are community partners that have specific resources created to help with engagement. So victim service providers and homeless education liaisons. Did someone just raise their hand? Am I wrong?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, so this list is not exhaustive. However, it should be viewed as a starting point to drive your outreach efforts. So these parts of your community can help you engage those with lived experience, help with volunteer recruitment, and also help with hotspot mapping. All right, so let's talk a little bit about safety. So the safety of pit leads and volunteers are our highest priority. So we also recommend reading over this list prior to the night of the count. So this list is specifically geared towards those doing unsheltered count. However, many of the tips still apply to the sheltered count as well. And it's always important to be mindful of the population that we're surveying, that we understand the situation that they're in. Homelessness can cause a great deal of psychological and physical trauma, so always be respectful of them as you would to your own neighbors. So some rules that we think are important to lay down on the night of the count is to not wake people up who are sleeping. Don't put yourself in a situation that makes you uncomfortable. Don't promise things you can't deliver. Don't share confidential information or deviate from the survey. So the first two items on this list are scenarios in which you would do an observational survey, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later. And the main takeaways are that you should be respectful, calm, and sincere. While you are unlikely to experience a dangerous situation, it's important to have a safe place in case there is de-escalation that might be required. Alrighty, so here are the 5 steps to completing the unsheltered survey. Make sure to start by identifying yourself and stating the purpose of the count. Remember to always obtain consent to the survey, and once you have consent, you can ask screening questions to determine if the individual is eligible. If they're not, thank them for their time and go ahead and move on. And if they are, administer the survey questions and record their responses. And lastly, ensure to thank the participant and provide any donated items, care packages, information, pamphlets, and resources. Okay, so let's go into some coordination tips. Here's a quick list of tips for preparing information for unsheltered pit volunteers. The best advice is to have these ready to go the day before the count and to have the information compiled about the week before. So perhaps create a checklist for volunteers and check in with them as they go in and out for their surveying shifts. We also recommend, again, providing a map of those hotspots, a interviewing guide or script, maybe a cheat sheet, volunteer hour tracker form if that's something you might be interested in, emergency contacts, and safety information, as well as instructions for registering for the app. All right, so let's dive into talking a bit about the sheltered count. Oh, we have a question from Lisa Griffin real quick. You can still count folks who don't want to participate in the survey, correct? Yeah, if you believe they are homeless and perhaps you feel you are in a situation where you feel uncomfortable approaching them, or they might be asleep or they don't consent to the survey, you can go ahead and complete an observational survey, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later on. But yes, to answer your question. All right, so let's talk a little bit about sheltered pit planning. So for sheltered count, we survey people residing in emergency shelters, which includes cold weather shelters, domestic violence shelters, and hotels or motels that are paid for by an agency voucher and transitional housing. So in order to be considered an emergency shelter or transitional housing project, they have to meet the following 3 criteria. So the primary intent of the projects is to serve literally homeless people is the first criteria. The second being the project verifies homeless statuses as part of its eligibility determination. And the actual project clients are predominantly homeless. All right, so to give a more detailed explanation of the location definitions, here are the HUD definitions of emergency shelter and transitional housing. So emergency shelters are any facility where the primary purpose is to provide temporary shelter for people experiencing homelessness in general, or for specific populations that don't require an occupant to sign a lease or occupancy agreement. And the transitional housing is meant to provide a homeless person or a family with interim stability and support to successfully move on to and maintain permanent housing. So just a quick note for emergency shelters, our recommendation is that you conduct those surveys when people are checking in for the night, as to not disturb them as they get rest or seek any kind of services that they may need. Alrighty, so now's the point we're going to shift into talking just a little bit about the housing inventory count. So The reason I think it's important to include both of these counts in the same presentation is because they happen simultaneously and they're analyzed together. So for those who aren't familiar, the HIC is the annual count of beds and units designated to serve those experiencing homelessness. It includes both emergency shelter and transitional housing, which are both counted for the point in time count. However, it also includes rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So a simple way to remember this is that the PIT measures people and the HIC measures housing. And when you look at them together, it demonstrates the scope of homelessness in your area, as well as your capacity to respond to the crisis. Okay, so here's a Venn diagram to demonstrate the similarities and differences between the sheltered PIT and HIC. I won't go over each bullet point too much in detail, but if I were to give a quick summary, the key differences is that the PIT requires individual surveys of each client residing in those emergency shelters or transitional housing program, which takes about 25 to 40 minutes per survey to complete. Whereas the HIC only requires you to fill out one form for each housing project that your organization has, which takes about 10 to 20 minutes total. So they're both required by HUD. They both happen at the same time, and I provide technical assistance for both. The PIT is driven by local leads with support from THN, whereas the HIC is driven by THN with support from local leads. All right, so here is a template of a letter that you can send to potential shelters to solicit their participation. You can find this downloadable on our website. All right, so let's talk a little bit about DV protocol real quick. So to give you some context, the PIT count is only gathering information on those who are actively fleeing a domestic violence situation. The question is not asking if someone has ever experienced domestic violence in their life. And this is the question, and its exact language right here on the slide. Are you currently staying in the shelter because of domestic violence? So here's some do's and don'ts for surveying DV survivors. So please make sure that your volunteers go over this list prior to the day of the count. Do not fill in the full name or the date of birth or the age of the survivor. You will provide their age range, of course, and any demographic information that they share, but please do not provide any identifying information on the survey or within the notes section. So once you've gotten past the name and age questions, please continue filling out the rest of the survey with them. And here's what your app should look like. You see, you'll have the first initial, not the full name, and the last initial. And again, we're not recording the age here, but we are recording the age range. And then after you complete this section, you can go ahead and move on to completing the rest of the survey for someone who is experiencing domestic violence. All right, so here's a quick list of coordination tips for your shelter count. We recommend verifying your list of shelters as soon as possible. I'll be sending out a list of emergency shelters and transitional housing projects in the coming weeks for this. So please keep an eye out for that. I'm hoping to have it out by next week, and also remain in regular contact with the shelter staff to ensure that you have a solid game plan if they need any additional volunteers to conduct surveys on the day of the count. So again, please be respectful of their processes and procedures when you're developing these strategies. And of course, ensure that all staff that will be surveying on the night of the count have appropriate training to prepare for the count, and loop me in if you have any questions or concerns if you need help reaching out to any of the shelters in your area. All right, so let's have a quick conversation about consent to the let's have a quick conversation about the importance of obtaining consent for participants. So you're only permitted to conduct a survey if you have been given verbal consent to do so. So you cannot complete the survey if you haven't obtained consent or if you haven't physically laid eyes on the individual on the day of the count. So if the individual wants to leave the conversation, you can go ahead and stop and submit the survey. And if they revoke their consent, you can go ahead and delete the survey if that's something that they ask for. Absolutely do not try to convince, coerce, or persuade someone to participate in the survey. And if you're unable to obtain consent, and you're unable to complete that sheltered or unsheltered survey for the above reasons, you have the option of completing a observational survey, which we're going to talk about real quick. All right, so the observation surveys can be conducted in both an unsheltered or sheltered situation. So you will use the observational survey perhaps if someone is sleeping, if you are unable to approach the individual, perhaps you might feel unsafe, or if they do not consent to the survey. So to conduct this survey, you must believe that this person is currently experiencing homelessness. And we also want to mention that you do not complete this survey using intake forms or based off of previous interactions. You must see the person on the day of the count, and we don't gather any kind of personal information or make any assumptions about the person based on their appearances, no matter the circumstances. All right, so here's a quick little flow chart, kind of demonstrating what kind of survey to administer depending on the situation. So let's say you're in a situation where the person is safe to approach and they have consented to the survey, then you would complete a sheltered or unsheltered survey depending on the location. So let's say that it was safe to approach, but perhaps the person didn't consent to the survey, or they were sleeping while you were conducting the survey. So of course we don't want to wake that person up. So we would conduct an observational survey in those situations. So let's say that the person tells you expressly that they don't experience homelessness, that they're not currently experiencing homelessness. So in that situation, we want to thank them for the time and do not complete a survey. And let's say that you're in a situation perhaps that this person is unsafe to approach. In that case, you would complete an observational survey. All right, so these are the overall guidelines for how to follow best practices when it comes to conducting the PIT count. So we always want to make sure that we are familiarizing ourselves with the survey, perhaps reading our scripts or reading all the questions out loud. We want to communicate our intentions to potential survey participants and always obtain consent to the survey. Express confidence and compassion when surveying. And when surveying individuals within a group, prioritize safety and protect participants' information. Whenever possible, we want to make sure that we give people as much privacy as they request. Make sure that we come up with a safety plan, maybe a safety phrase for discomfort amongst your team, and no volunteer expectations, and know your community's resources. All right, so we're getting through it. All right, so to talk a little bit about the service-based count, these are an optional supplemental count that can be used in conjunction with the night of the count approach. So you must participate in the formal count in order to also conduct a service-based count. And this service-based count occurs at non-shelter service locations. So this can be something like a day shelter, a soup kitchen, or perhaps a food bank, where those experiencing homelessness might seek out resources and services. So in order to participate for the service-based count, you must notify me by November 11th, 2022. So you'll need to provide a list of service locations by the end of December, and any surveys not conducted at the predefined locations will be immediately archived. So for more information on this type of survey, please reach out to me. Again, my contact information is at the end. And again, the deadline to notify me if this is something that you might want to participate in is November 11th, 2022. Okay, folks, so let's talk a little bit about paper surveys. So we do have paper surveys and we're willing to work with you if you want to use them. However, we strongly encourage that you and your volunteers use the app. It not only helps with data quality, but it also ensures that there is less room for error or in case your surveys get lost. So you're only permitted to use the paper surveys developed by THN and you're required to send all the surveys to THN directly after inputting them. So any paper surveys created by anyone other than THN will be immediately archived. All right, so before we go into some volunteer coordination information, that rhymed, I want to stop here again and see if we have any questions before we go ahead and move on and wrap up. I'm getting through it today, folks. Nothing, not seeing anything in the chat. I'll give it a minute just in case. All righty, well, I'm not seeing too many questions. All righty, so we'll just go ahead and keep going. If you have any questions at any point, you can just go ahead and drop them in the chat. I don't mind stopping real quick to address those. Okay, so let's talk a bit about some volunteer responsibilities. So there are many roles that volunteers can play leading up to, during, and after the count. And your community will need to determine the number of volunteers you require and the skills and experiences that they should have. So once you determine the number of volunteers that you need, definitely try to develop a process to assign them teams. For example, assign the team leader to a volunteer who has experience working with homeless populations. And regardless of their relevant experience, assign the team leader role to only volunteers who are interested in that leadership position. And make sure that we also tailor our volunteer roles to people's interests, perhaps people who might be more interested in doing outreach and going and doing unsheltered counts, or perhaps someone who is more interested in soliciting donations, getting care packages together. Yeah. So let's go ahead and talk a bit about the debrief process. Please have some type of debrief process with your volunteers. You should develop both a critical incident debrief protocol in case that happens. Again, that's very rare, as well as general feedback form to help gauge how the process went, as well as the likelihood that they will return for the next count. So please contact THN immediately if there are any critical incidents reported to you so we can address those. And here's a bit of an example of a feedback form that we could use. This is also available on our website for download. You could use this paper survey right here, or you could create your own survey in Google Forms or any other kind of free surveying software just to gauge how the process went for other people. All right, so let's get into talking a bit about collaboration. So as you begin planning your count, consider how this initiative can be an effective way to engage your community in the effort to end homelessness. So also recognize that the success of the count depends on effective community engagement. So a pit count can help inform and educate key stakeholders within your community, and this can include aspects of your community such as the general public, media, policymakers, the business sector, social services sector, and people who experience homelessness themselves and people with lived experience. So cross-sector collaboration will encourage participation and provide additional resources to support the count, including money, volunteers, supplies, and expert knowledge. All righty. So the count can also help your community understand and address homelessness differently. So the process of planning and implementing your count can generate cross-sector coordination that may be leveraged as you implement other initiatives. So this can include an overall plan to end homelessness within your communities, prioritizing a housing first program, system coordination, or by name lists. And of course, doing this count collaboratively can also increase support in your efforts and facilitate new alliances and build and strengthen partnerships. At a minimum, you should consider how you will use this information you obtain during the count to generate action on homelessness. An objective that does require community participation and coordination. That rhymed. All right, so let's talk a bit about engaging law enforcement, like I mentioned earlier. So there are a few things to kind of consider when weighing whether or not you want to engage law enforcement in your point in time counts. So here's some questions to kind of consider as you think about planning. So does your local law enforcement already do some type of homeless outreach? Have they expressed any kind of interest in participating in your LHC or pit count? If you have an LHC, have you noticed any changes in their response to the statewide camping ban? And finally, what role have they played in the past? Did it go well? Did it prioritize the safety and well-being of those who are being surveyed? So all of these questions should be considered before choosing to engage law enforcement in the upcoming point in time count. So here are some best practices to consider for engaging law enforcement. So they shouldn't be surveying people, and if they are, they should be in plain clothes and in unmarked cars. Limit their roles to help identifying hotspots prior to the count and address any kind of safety concerns as well. We strongly want to say that they should not be ticketing or arresting people on the day of the count, of course. And if you have any concerns about law enforcement impeding in your count, maybe try to minimize public-facing messages around the date of the pit count. And if they are interested, see if they would be willing to attend perhaps a training or a meeting focused on combating the myths around homelessness. And reach out to us if you need any further support or assistance with this. This can be kind of difficult, talking about the myths around homelessness and combating those. So I'm definitely here to help with that. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about subpopulations. It is very important to make sure that we're engaging all of these subpopulations in the count: survivors of domestic violence, youth and families, and veterans especially. Not only attempting to find them on the day of the count, but also bringing them to the table in terms of planning and organizing. So there are resources on our website regarding engaging these subpopulations. And you can also, like I mentioned, you can download this PowerPoint. They're linked on here. So you can just click on these and you'll have that PowerPoint. And again, reach out to me if you have any questions or need any help with engaging these subpopulations. So here's some things to consider when engaging subpopulations. So we want to consider what populations in our communities are the most prevalent. What populations in your community are we already engaging? And what populations are we not engaging? What community partners are missing from your community? Cannot talk today, I'm so sorry. What community partners are missing from your communities in order to better engage those populations? And if you need to add people to those groups. All right, so let's talk a little bit about engaging those with lived experience. Again, this is something that is very important to a successful pit count. So people who have experienced homelessness are an indispensable resource to a successful point in time count of unsheltered people, and they should be actively involved in your point in time counts. So many COCs rely on input and assistance from currently or formerly homeless people when planning, organizing, and implementing the count. When recruiting people who are homeless and staying in emergency shelters or transitional housing, pit lead should also be sensitive to any shelter restrictions that could limit participation, such as program curfews or other requirements. And I also want to take a minute to remind everyone that if you are recruiting anyone with lived experience, especially those who are currently experiencing homelessness, you must pay them and compensate them for their time. Again, they're experts and they should be treated as such. All right, so this is just a flow chart outlining our decision process to determine how we conduct the pit count based on safety concerns due to COVID-19. At this time, we're going to go ahead and move forward with just a full count on Thursday, January 26th, like we mentioned, and we don't expect me to kind of engage in this process. Hopefully, we'll all keep our fingers crossed. If things do change as we approach the count, you will be the first to know, and we don't expect this to happen again, but we also want to mention that safety is our #1 priority, and we're going to keep an eye on the situation as things unfold. All right. So we are going to go ahead and wrap up. So the next trainings for pit leads after we complete this one are the pre-count webinar on how to use the data gathering app that I mentioned earlier, and the regional command center that we use to view our data. So there will also be a post-count webinar on how to read your data. This will be after the point in time count around March or April. We did one last year and we found it was very helpful. And there will also be pre-recorded volunteer training released around December that can be accessed at any time, and we'll also be releasing those slides for you as well on our website. So in addition, if you give me a few weeks notice, I am more than happy to conduct a virtual volunteer training if that's something that you might be interested in. Please reach out to me and just let me know if that's something that you would like for your community. I'm more than willing to do that. So we will also be providing training for our shelter counts as well, and there'll be a series of additional presentations posted to the THN website to help you engage your providers in the pit count. And I would also like to mention that we will be having a sign-up form sometime in December for individual community check-in calls. So it'll be kind of like a Zoom meeting where you can come in and receive guidance. And we'll also be holding a few office hours conference calls. So it's an office hour style meeting where we'll just start it and you can come in and out as you please and receive guidance. Something that we did last year that we found was also very helpful. And those are opportunities where you can receive guidance or ask any questions that you may have. So let's go over a quick tentative timeline for our upcoming point time count. So this month, we have our mandatory pit lead training webinar that's happening right now. So we're also going to finalize that shelter list. I'm going to send out that shelter list to y'all hopefully next week, and y'all's responsibility is to get primary contact information for those shelters and confirm that they are still open and operating, and get their participation in the upcoming 2023 point in time count. And then we're going to begin mapping unsheltered locations. And again, this is something that should be happening throughout the process. And as we get closer to the pit count, we should make sure that we confirm those unsheltered locations to make sure that people are still there. Around November, we're going to try to begin volunteer recruitment and community engagement. Again, that's going to look different for every community. We're also going to be having our mobile app training webinar. It's going to be similar to this, where you'll have a couple of opportunities to attend. And then we'll have our deadline to sign up for that service-based count or paper surveys. Again, that's going to be around November 11th. And then we'll have those office hours support call opportunities begin towards the end of November. And then in December, we're going to want to continue volunteer recruitment. You'll have that opportunity to sign up for one-on-one support calls. And cannot talk, I'm so sorry. We'll also have refresher materials released by THN, and volunteer training materials will also be released as well. So that pre-recorded volunteer training, as well as the PowerPoint. And then in January, we're gonna recommend that y'all start training your volunteers, finalize your shelter engagement plan, look over any training materials and presentations just to refresh yourself, and then actually conduct the pit counts on January 26th, that Thursday. Okay, so here are the next steps as we progress towards our pit count. So we're going to be scheduling the mobile app training that will be going over the counting of the app that we use to gather data, and the regional command center that we use to view our data. If you have not done so already, please begin forming your pit committees, and please be on the lookout for that sheltered location list from myself coming in the form of an email pretty soon. And start developing your volunteer recruitment plan and begin recruiting volunteers if you have the capacity to do so. And you can also request volunteer trainings if that's something that you might be interested in for me to conduct for y'all. And finally, be on the lookout for those opportunities for support calls, as well as any other email updates that might come your way. All right, so I know that that was a lot of information, and that was kind of a long presentation. I want to just check in and see, and use the remainder of this time to see if we have any questions. I already see one in the chat. Mentioned you'd provide the link for the PowerPoint, but I don't see that link in the chat.
Here it is.
There it is. Okay. And it's also on our website as well under our pit count tab. Craig, do we want to maybe allow people to unmute themselves?
For this one, I have to do it one by one.
Oh, okay. Will there be, okay, we have one from Leah. Will there be any specific THN trainings that local volunteers are required to complete? So the trainings that are similar to this one, like the mobile app training, volunteers won't be required to attend those. We will be releasing that pre-made volunteer recording that y'all can use for your volunteers. We do recommend that you require volunteers to attend that training just so they're familiar with the process. And it is Pit Lead's responsibility to train them on how to use the mobile app, Counting Us, and the regional command center that they can use to view the data. But in terms of the webinars that we put on, unless you request that I conduct a virtual volunteer training, then no, there's not particular ones that they're required to complete. We just recommend that they are trained using. Yeah, we'll be sending out a. We're going to be sending out our scheduling for the mobile app training in the next few weeks. So that's going to be happening around mid-November. I think the week of the 17th, if I am not mistaken. Anybody else? Any other takers? I guess that means I did a pretty decent job of presenting this information. Again, you can always email me if something comes up later. Yeah, no worries. I guess I'll give it like 5 more minutes to see if anybody has anything, and then I guess we can let y'all go a little bit early. All righty, I am not seeing any questions. I'm not seeing any raised hands.
You want to go ahead and call it?
I guess we'll go ahead and call it. Yeah. So here's my contact information, y'all. You can reach me by my email, alex@thn.org, and my phone number, 512-652-4714. You'll leave a voicemail and I might not answer. I'll be able to get back to you within 24 hours. As we get into pit season, I'm going to try to be as diligent as possible as responding to any of your questions. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me. It's what I'm here for. And I love being able to help people. So that's why I do what I do. So, yeah, thank you all so much for joining me for this point in time count presentation. And I'm excited to work with you all. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Yeah. All right. Bye, y'all.